The system doesn't make mistakes, so when it flagged an active werewolf as erased, I knew someone was about to die. That was the thought that slipped in before the coffee finished dripping, before the office fully woke up around me. It settled low and cold, like a coin dropped into my stomach. Morning at the city registration center always smelled the same: burnt coffee, disinfectant, and something metallic that never quite left the air. Glass walls caught the pale light from the windows and scattered it across metal desks and polished floors. Screens hummed. Lists scrolled. Names appeared, resolved into neat lines of data, and vanished again. Routine was the point. Routine was safety. I wrapped my hands around my mug and stared at the central console, letting my eyes skim the flow the way they always did, half attention, half muscle memory. Registered. Cleared. Updated. Deferred. Corrected. Alive, alive, alive. Then the red line slid into view. It wasn't loud. It didn't blink. It didn't trigger an alarm. It just existed. A single entry highlighted in a muted crimson, as if the system itself were embarrassed to draw attention to it. I leaned closer. Status: registered. Activity: active. Archive flag: erased. My jaw tightened before I realized I'd clenched it. The coffee tasted suddenly wrong. "That's not funny," I muttered, though no one was joking. The system did not allow contradictions. It was built on clean binaries. Yes or no, valid or void. An erased record was dead data. Archived, purged, gone. An active registrant was breathing, monitored, traceable. You could not be both. The code simply didn't permit it. I ran a manual refresh. The line stayed. I filtered by timestamp. The entry had been updated 43 minutes ago, before most of the building arrived, before the morning shift officially started, which meant it had been done quietly. My reflection stared back at me from the dark edge of the screen. 30-something, neat hair, neutral expression. The kind of face people trusted with forms and decisions. A good beta face. Calm, reasonable, harmless. Inside, something had gone very still. I pulled the entry into a private window and felt the familiar chill spread through my abdomen, the one that always came when I recognized a pattern I didn't want to see. Not fear exactly. Anticipation, like standing on a curb and hearing a car you couldn't see yet. Glass walls muted the rest of the floor, but I could still sense the movement. Chairs rolling, someone laughing near the printers, the soft chime of the elevator opening. Normal life, flowing smoothly while the machine did what it always did. When the system encountered contradictions, it didn't argue. It corrected. And correction was never gentle. I checked the internal notes. Empty. No supervisor tag. No automated explanation. Whoever had touched this record had known how to avoid leaving fingerprints, or had the authority not to need them. I swallowed and forced myself to breathe slowly through my nose. The air filters dulled most scents, but stress always had a smell to it, sharp, almost acidic, like overheated circuitry. My shoulders were tight. I rolled them once, carefully, as if that could unknot what was happening under my ribs. There were only two reasons a line like this would exist. Someone had pressed the wrong button, or someone had pressed exactly the right one. I opened the metadata trail, peeling back layers the way you might lift floorboards in a house that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Access nodes, timestamps, location pings. Everything looked clean, too clean. My cursor hovered over the final field, the one I hadn't looked at yet. I already knew what would be there. The system always left the name for last, as if saving the most human part for the end. I clicked. Name: Silas Vane. The name didn't ring any bells at first. No immediate flash of recognition, no dramatic jolt. Just a quiet click somewhere in my head, like a lock finding the right groove. I stared at it longer than I meant to. Silas Vane, Omega class registrant, multiple historical amendments, restricted notes sealed above my clearance level, which was impressive, considering my clearance level. My fingers rested on the keyboard without moving. Around me, the morning continued to assemble itself. Lights brightening, screens syncing, the system breathing in data and breathing it back out again. This wasn't a bug. Bugs were messy, accidental, This was deliberate. A red line wasn't an error. It was a mark, and marks like that were never left unless someone wanted them found. I closed the private window and let the main feed wash back over the screen, hiding the contradiction beneath layers of normality. For now, my reflection returned, composed and unremarkable, exactly what the city liked in the man who ran its registry. But the cold in my stomach didn't fade. Somewhere in this city an erased werewolf was still active, still breathing, still moving through streets the system believed he no longer existed in. Which meant the clock had already started, and I had just found the trail. By 9:30, the red line was buried under 1,000 perfectly ordinary ones. That was the beauty of the system. It didn't need to hide its sins, it just drowned them in paperwork. I moved through the office with my tablet tucked under my arm, nodding where I was expected to nod, stopping where people needed answers that were already written into policy. Glass walls reflected me back in fragments, profile, badge, the neutral set of my mouth. A man who belonged exactly where he stood. "Morning, boss," someone called as I passed the intake desks. "Morning," I answered, automatically. A pair of clerks were arguing over whose turn it was to refill the coffee machine. Someone else was telling a joke about an alpha who'd tried to register his emotional support motorcycle as a dependent. Laughter rippled, easy and unforced, the kind that said the world was functioning as intended. I smiled at the right places. I always did. Deputy Director Rowan caught up with me near the conference room, his shoes too polished for someone who claimed to work late nights. He was already grinning, tablet in hand, eyes bright with numbers only he could see. "Matt, just the man I wanted," he said. Monthly compliance metrics came in. "We're ahead of target." "Good," I said. It was the correct response. Rowan clapped me on the shoulder, a little too familiarly. "This is why you're invaluable. No drama, no surprises. You keep things clean." Clean. Right. In the conference room, the lights dimmed automatically as the screens activated. Charts bloomed across the glass wall. Registrations up, anomalies down, correction timelines shortened. Rowan talked in percentages and projections, his voice full of confidence. The city loved men like him. Men who believed that if the data looked good, it was good. And none of this would work without solid management at the registry level, he concluded, turning slightly toward me. Matt's team has been rock steady. A few heads turned. A few nods. Approval passed over me like a mild breeze. "Reliable as ever," someone added. I inclined my head. Didn't speak. Didn't contradict. A good beta knows when not to interrupt. After the meeting, June intercepted me by the elevators. She was balancing a stack of forms against her chest, dark curls already escaping her bun, eyes too earnest for this building. "Mr. Hale, do you have a second?" I glanced at the clock. "Walk with me." She fell into step beside me as we entered the elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing us into soft light and muted air. "I was reviewing last quarter's correction reports," she said quickly, like she was afraid of losing her nerve. "And I noticed something odd." I kept my gaze forward. "What kind of odd?" "There's been an increase in Omega cases flagged for expedited resolution." She hesitated, lowering her voice. "That usually means correction," I finished for her. She nodded, lips pressed together. "Or worse." The elevator hummed as it descended. Floors ticked by. Somewhere between 12 and 10. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. "June," I said gently, "the system prioritizes risk. Omegas statistically." "I know the statistics," she interrupted, then flushed. "Sorry, some of them don't look like risks. Some of them are just people who made one bad choice." I finally looked at her. Really looked. She hadn't learned yet how to file concern down into something smaller and safer. "You did the right thing bringing it up," I said. Which was also true. "I'll review it." Relief flickered across her face. "Thank you." The doors opened. She stepped out, purpose renewed, belief intact. I stayed inside until the doors closed again. Correction, utilization, disposal. The system had a whole vocabulary for making violence sound procedural. I knew every term, knew the timestamps that meant a file would be quietly rerouted. Knew how often those files belonged to omegas. Too volatile, too inconvenient, too hard to classify. I didn't argue in meetings. I didn't raise my voice. I asked my questions in code and made my changes in margins no one else bothered to read. That was why they trusted me. By late afternoon, Rowan's assistant sent a priority notice to my console. Operational briefing, 22 hours, mandatory attendance. I opened the file. Night raid, joint task force, target, unlicensed scent modification lab operating below the East Industrial District. My jaw tightened again. The system was moving, and this time, it was hunting smells that didn't belong. I closed the file and stood, smoothing my jacket as if that could smooth what was coming next. Around me, the office wound down into end-of-day quiet, unaware of the lines being drawn beneath it. Somewhere in the city, someone was about to run. And tonight, I'd be ordered to help catch them. The city smelled wrong that night. Not the usual blend of oil, rain-soaked asphalt, and overheated engines, but something sharper, unstable, like a note played half a step off. Even before we reached the industrial district, my jaw was tight, my senses straining against filters that suddenly felt too thin. The convoy cut its lights 3 blocks out. We moved on foot from there. The building was a concrete husk wedged between a closed meatpacking plant and a row of condemned warehouses. No sign, no windows worth breaking. Just a steel door sweating rust and moisture, breathing out a faint chemical tang. Target confirmed, someone murmured in my earpiece. Rowan's voice followed, clipped and pleased. Clean and quick. Minimal disruption. Minimal. Right. The door came down under the ram, metal screaming as it buckled inward. Sound exploded. Boots. Shouts. Alarms shrieking like wounded animals. The air hit me all at once. Wet walls, mold, cheap disinfectant, failing to mask deeper sins, and scent. It jumped, not flowed, not layered. It snapped from alpha-leaning heat to something hollow and thin, then flared sharp enough to make my eyes sting. My stomach turned. This wasn't one identity or even 2. It was a mess of half-built signatures colliding and shedding. Move! Someone shouted. Figures scattered down narrow corridors, knocking over tables crowded with glassware and humming devices. Liquid shattered, splashing across the floor in iridescent streaks. Lamps flickered, casting the space in sickly yellow pulses. Shadows ran in every direction. Chaos, by design. I stayed back from the first wave, my role unofficial but understood. Observe, identify, decide. My gaze tracked movement, cataloging details my brain had learned to prioritize. Too young, too thin, modified, not modified enough. Then I saw him. He wasn't running. He stood near the far wall, one hand resting on a metal table as if this were an inconvenience rather than a raid. Dark hair, pulled back, carelessly. Clothes practical, worn soft by use. His posture was loose, balanced. Someone who knew exactly how fast he could move if he chose to. And he was smiling. Not wide, not manic. Just enough to show he wasn't afraid. Our eyes met across the room, and something sharp slid down my spine. He looked directly at me. Not at my badge, not at the armed officers flooding the lab. At me. "You're late," he said, voice carrying easily through the noise. I took a step forward before I realized I'd moved. "Silas Vane," I said. His name felt strange in my mouth, too solid for someone who officially didn't exist. His smile tilted. Ah. So the machine sent its favorite interface. An officer lunged for him. Silas pivoted smoothly, using the table as leverage, slipping out of reach with practiced ease. Glass shattered again. Someone swore. "Don't," I said sharply, and hated that my voice cut through the room the way it did. Silas's eyes flicked back to mine, bright with amusement. "You see? Even your tone is calibrated. What are you doing here?" I asked. He laughed. Quiet, genuine. "Fixing what you people break. I don't break people." That earned me a look, measuring, unimpressed. "Sure you don't. You just file the aftermath." He moved closer, deliberately slow, stopping just outside arm's reach. I caught his scent fully then. and my breath stalled. It was wrong. Not corrupted. Not artificial. Just unplaceable. The markers didn't settle. They slid, rearranged, refused to lock. My instincts reached for categories they'd relied on for decades and came back empty-handed. Omega, my training whispered. But it didn't stick. My skin prickled. Heat crawled up the back of my neck. "You're Matt Hale," Silas said softly. Not a question. City registry. Good beta. Clean hands. I didn't correct him. "People like you love numbers," he continued. "You pretend they make you neutral." An officer shouted from behind him. Another tried to flank. Silas's gaze never left mine. "But you smell like someone who knows exactly how many bodies it takes to keep the system quiet." That hit closer than it should have. I opened my mouth, to warn him, to order him restrained. I wasn't sure. And he was gone, one moment there. The next a blur of motion as he vaulted over debris, ducking into a side corridor barely visible behind hanging plastic sheeting. Someone fired a stun round. It hit the wall, sparking uselessly. After him. Rowan barked over comms. We chased shadows and echoes. The corridor forked, then forked again. Doors slammed. Footsteps vanished into ventilation shafts, too narrow to follow. And then, nothing. Silence rushed in to fill the space he'd left, thick and disorienting. The lab was secured within minutes, detainees restrained, equipment cataloged. Another mess labeled for cleanup. But I stood still, staring at the floor where Silas had been. Something lay there, not dropped by accident. Placed. A small vial, cracked but intact, its contents glowing faintly under the flickering lights. I crouched and picked it up, fingers tingling as I did. The scent inside was unmistakable now. Not masked, not diluted, a calling card, an invitation. I closed my fist around it and straightened, heart beating faster than it had any right to. The street didn't smell the same anymore. And Silas Vane had wanted me to notice. The building sounded different at night. During the day, the city registration center breathed. Keyboards tapping, printers whining, voices rising and falling in polite frustration. After midnight, it held its breath. The air conditioning clicked on and off like a nervous habit. My footsteps echoed too loudly on polished floors as I crossed the empty corridor toward my office. I locked the door behind me and dimmed the lights. Silas Vane's file filled the main screen, its glow the only illumination left. Lines of data stacked neatly, as if order itself were trying to convince me this made sense. It didn't. Multiple identification shifts over 8 years, status toggles that shouldn't have been possible without triggering audits. Entire months where his trail went cold, then reappeared under a new classification. Omega, beta adjacent, Omega again. Once, briefly, unassigned, officially, the system marked him as deceased 3 years ago. Cause correction failure, which meant his name should never have surfaced again. And yet there it was, active, flagged, red. I rubbed a hand over my face, feeling the grit of exhaustion under my skin. The vial from the lab sat on my desk, sealed in evidence plastic, a faint glow leaking through like a heartbeat. Even filtered, I could sense it. Unstable, alive. "You don't fit," I murmured to the screen. The file scrolled smoothly as I dug deeper, into layers most people never touched. Override logs, access hierarchies, hidden fields meant to keep auditors satisfied while decisions happened elsewhere. That was when I saw it. A pattern. Tiny deviations. Fractions of a second where the system hesitated before finalizing a correction. Records marked complete, but never fully closed. Not enough to raise alarms. Just enough to leave space. My space. The first time had been almost a decade ago. I'd still believed I could work within the rules back then. I remembered the file vividly. A young Omega flagged for behavioral volatility after refusing a mandatory pairing. The recommendation had come down clean and cold, correction, followed by disposal if stabilization failed. I'd stared at that screen for hours, fingers hovering uselessly over the keys. Every policy said the same thing: necessary, efficient, humane, Lies dressed as procedure. I hadn't deleted the file. I hadn't falsified it outright. I'd done something smaller, quieter. I'd delayed it. A misplaced timestamp, a duplicated checksum, just enough confusion to reroute the case for additional review. By the time anyone noticed, the Omega had vanished into the city's blind spots. I never learned his name. But that night, walking out of the building with my hands shaking and my mouth tasting like metal, I'd understood something essential. If I was going to stay, I couldn't be clean. I had to be useful. The corridors outside my office felt longer as the memory faded. Glass walls reflected rows of empty desks, all of them waiting patiently for morning. I leaned back in my chair and let Silas's file split across 3 screens, layering timelines and scent logs until the overlap made my head ache. He'd become something else in the years since, less a person in the data, more a rumor. Field reports referenced an unlicensed modifier who could change a werewolf's scent without collapsing their identity. Whispers of Omegas walking free without registry trackers. Alphas who passed inspections only to vanish weeks later. Some reports dismissed it as urban myth. Others were less comfortable. One note, buried deep in an internal memo, referred to him as a destabilizing influence. Another called him contagious. I almost laughed. He was doing in blood what I'd been doing in paper. And somehow, impossibly, we'd never crossed paths until now. I stood and paced the length of my office, the city's distant glow pressing against the windows. My reflection followed me, fragmented and faint. A man built out of margins and footnotes, convincing himself that careful cruelty was better than honest violence. Silas Vane didn't bother with margins. I stopped at the desk and pulled up the access history again, narrowing the time frame around the red line's appearance. The entry had been touched from inside the registry, not from the field, not automated. From my building. My fingers slowed as a user ID resolved on screen. Not mine. Not Rowan's. Someone with just enough clearance to slip between layers. Someone who knew where the quiet paths were. A mole. I exhaled slowly, the realization settling into place, with unwelcome clarity. The system hadn't just been marked, it had been guided, and whoever was feeding Silas information had been watching us just as closely as we'd been watching him. I closed the file and leaned my forehead briefly against the cool glass of the window. Below, the city pulsed, alive, messy, impossible to fully categorize. Paper could cut, blood could stain, and somewhere between the two, someone was playing a very careful game. I straightened, already planning my next move. If there was a mole in my registry, I would find them. And if Silas Vane had become a myth on the street, then I needed to understand why he'd chosen to leave me a trail. The report came in just after dawn, buried in routine language, and flagged low priority. That alone told me something was wrong. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when June hesitated by my desk, tablet clutched tight against her chest. Her eyes darted toward the glass walls, then back to me. "Mr. Hale, there's an incident report from the South Docks," she said quietly. "It's unofficial." "Nothing is unofficial," I replied, already reaching for the tablet. "Just poorly labeled." She handed it over. Subject, unregistered individual. Suspected modifier. Status, detained. Location, temporary holding facility, warehouse 17. No name. No registry number, no agency signature. I felt the familiar cold bloom low in my stomach. Warehouse 17 wasn't ours. It was a repurposed storage site the city pretended not to remember, used by contractors who specialized in containment before cases were formally transferred. A gray space where people went missing before paperwork caught up. I scrolled faster. Witness accounts described a rapid extraction. No city markings, no registry uniforms. Efficient. Surgical. Someone had grabbed Silas before we could. And they hadn't done it to erase him. They'd done it to use him. "June," I said, keeping my voice even. "Who forwarded this?" She shook her head. "It just appeared. Routed through 3 internal channels. Like someone wanted it seen but not traced." "Of course they did." I handed the tablet back. "Go home early today." Her brows knit together. "Sir?" Order from me, I said gently. And don't open any messages marked supplemental. She hesitated, then nodded. Okay. I waited until she disappeared down the corridor before I moved. Official protocol was clear. If an unregistered Omega with suspected illegal modifications was detained by an external party, the registry could intervene only through formal request. Review, authorization, transfer. By the time all that cleared, Silas would be broken down into a formula, or worse, replicated. I pulled up the secure channel to Deputy Director Rowan, my finger hovering over the call icon. One word from him and a task force would descend on Warehouse 17 in under an hour. One word, and Silas would be processed as contraband. I closed the channel. Ignoring it entirely would be cleaner, safer. Let the city's shadow economy eat itself and pretend my hands were clean. I stared at my reflection in the blackened screen. I had been many things in this building. Careful, quiet, useful. I had never been innocent. The old access path was still there. I hadn't used it in years. An emergency maintenance override tied to legacy infrastructure, buried so deep even most auditors didn't know it existed. Officially deprecated, functionally invisible. I keyed it in from memory. The system hesitated, then opened. Warehouse 17's schematics bloomed onto the display, grainy and outdated, but recognizable. I mapped camera feeds, power grids, blind spots. Whoever was holding Silas knew how to lock doors, but they weren't city engineers. That was their mistake. I shut down my workstation, grabbed my coat, and slipped my badge into my pocket instead of clipping it to my collar. In the elevator, I caught my reflection again. Tie loosened, eyes sharper than they'd been in years. I looked less like a manager, more like a man making a decision he couldn't file away. The drive across the city passed in a blur of red lights and rain-slick streets. The closer I got to the docks, the heavier the air became. Salt, oil, old iron. The city's edges always smelled like abandonment. I parked 2 blocks out and walked the rest of the way. Warehouse 17 squatted at the end of a dead street. Its windows boarded, its loading bay chained shut. No signage, no guards visible. Too quiet. I circled once, counting exits. Listening. A low hum leaked through the walls. Generators, cheap ones, temporary, like the holding cells inside. This wasn't a prison. It was a waiting room. I pressed my palm against the cold metal door and felt the vibration of movement inside. My pulse thudded in my ears, steady and insistent. I hadn't done this in years. Not like this. No forms, no witnesses, no layers of deniability. Just me, an old door in the system, and a choice I'd already made. I drew a slow breath and reached for the override on my phone, thumb hovering for half a second longer than necessary. Then I activated it. Somewhere inside the warehouse, a lock clicked open, and for the first time in a very long while, I stepped fully out of the machine and into the dark. The door didn't swing open. It groaned, metal scraping against concrete, the sound loud enough to set my teeth on edge. The smell hit me first. Old blood, sweat, fear that had nowhere to go and nowhere to dissipate. It clung to the air, thick and sour, like something alive had been left here too long. The lights inside flickered, cheap fluorescence buzzing overhead. The room beyond was low-ceilinged and cramped, walls stained with moisture and rust. Chains bolted into concrete, a chair overturned, a smear on the floor that my brain refused to identify too closely. This wasn't a holding facility. This was where people were softened up. I moved fast, quieter than I felt, following the faint sounds of breathing deeper inside. My pulse was loud in my ears. Every step felt like a mistake already made. Voices echoed from behind a partition. 2 men arguing in low tones. Told you not to push him. He's fine. He heals. That's the point. I didn't wait. I hit the first one with the butt of my gun, hard enough to drop him without ceremony. The second lunged. We went down together, sliding in something slick. My elbow connected with his throat. He gagged, hands clawing uselessly at my jacket before he went still. No elegance, no clean lines, just bodies and breath, and the sharp edge of panic. I staggered to my feet, and pushed through the partition. Silas was slumped against the far wall, wrists bound overhead with industrial cuffs, shirt torn open and dark with blood, his head lolled forward, hair sticking to his face. One eye was swollen shut. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. Then his remaining eye opened, and he laughed. A soft, broken sound. "Wow," he rasped. "You really do exist." "Don't talk," I said, crossing the room in 3 steps. My hands shook as I reached for the cuffs. "I'm getting you out." "Registry rescue," he murmured. "That's a new one." The cuffs didn't release cleanly. I swore under my breath and yanked harder than I should have. Silas hissed as his weight shifted suddenly, collapsing into me. I caught him on instinct. The moment our bodies connected, everything went wrong. Heat flared along my arms. My senses spiked violently, like feedback through a bad circuit. His scent, raw, unfiltered, flooded past my own dampeners, slamming into instincts I kept buried under layers of policy and habit. It didn't settle. It collided. My vision swam. For a second, the room tilted, and I had the insane impression that the system inside my head, the neat internal filing cabinet I'd relied on my entire life, was frantically trying to assign labels and failing. Omega, no. Beta adjacent, no. Unassigned, error. My knees locked to keep us both upright. Silas sucked in a sharp breath, fingers digging into my jacket. "Oh," he said faintly. "That's unpleasant." "Stay with me," I said. My voice sounded too tight. "You're bleeding." "Yeah," he replied dryly. "That happens when people try to turn you into a tool." I shifted him carefully, lowering him to sit against the wall. My hands were already stained red. I pressed a cloth from my pocket to his side, trying not to think about how warm he was, how wrong it felt that the contact didn't resolve into anything recognizable. His eye tracked my movements, sharp despite the pain. "You don't smell like them," he said suddenly. I froze. "Like who?" "People who come down here to finish things." His mouth twitched. "You smell like hesitation." I snorted despite myself. "That's not a compliment. Didn't mean it to be." He sucked in a breath as I tightened the pressure. His jaw clenched, muscles standing out along his neck. For all his bravado, his body was betraying him. Tremors, shallow breathing, the faint edge of shock creeping in. "Why were they holding you?" I asked. "Because I fix problems," he said. "And because someone decided problems should be scalable." I glanced at the unconscious men behind us. "They wanted to replicate your work. Or me." His gaze sharpened. "Depends on how optimistic you are about human decency." Silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the lights. After a moment, he spoke again. Quieter this time. "You know," he said, "this isn't the first time the system tried to erase me." My hands stilled. "I was 19, he continued. "Freshly flagged, too unstable, too difficult to place. They said I'd failed correction." I swallowed. "You shouldn't remember that." "Oh, I do." His smile was thin. "I remember waking up in a room like this. I remember thinking, that was it." He looked at me then. Really looked. "And then someone made a mistake." The room seemed to narrow. "They delayed the final order," he said. "Just long enough. No explanation. No follow-up." I slipped through. My chest tightened painfully. "They never found out who did it," Silas went on. "I figured it was just luck. Or a glitch." The words stacked up, fitting together with horrifying precision. The timestamp. The old override. The Omega who vanished before disposal. My Omega. It felt like the floor dropped out from under me. I stared at him, at the shape of his face, the familiar defiance that suddenly made terrible sense. "It was me," I said hoarsely. Silas blinked. "What?" "I was the one who delayed it," I said. The confession burned. I changed the routing. I made the system hesitate. For a heartbeat. He just stared. Then something in his expression hardened. A laugh tore out of him, sharp and humorless. "You." "I didn't know it was you," I said quickly. "I never knew your name. You just played God with a keyboard," he snapped, trying and failing. to pull away from my grip. Pain flared across his face. You don't get credit for that. I wasn't looking for... No, he cut in, eyes blazing. You were looking to sleep at night. The words hit harder than any blow. He laughed again, breath hitching. Do you know what that makes you, Matt Hale? I didn't answer. My biggest mistake, he said, because I survived. And you got to pretend you were still clean. Silence fell heavy between us, thick with blood and truth. I eased my hands away, giving him space he clearly needed. Outside, sirens wailed distantly, too far to matter yet. Silas closed his eyes, jaw tight, breathing through the pain. When he opened them again, the look he gave me wasn't grateful. It was furious, and I knew, with a clarity that hurt, that saving him had never been the worst mistake. Letting him find out why, that was. The safe house smelled like antiseptic and old dust. It was one of the registry's forgotten assets, technically decommissioned, practically invisible. A narrow apartment wedged between two abandoned offices, with reinforced doors and windows that didn't open. Functional. Ugly. Perfect. Silas sat on the edge of the bed, shirt discarded. A fresh bandage wrapped tight around his ribs. His skin had gone pale under the bruises, but his posture was still defiant. Shoulders squared like pain was a minor inconvenience, rather than something gnawing at him from the inside. I stood by the counter, rinsing blood from my hands that wasn't all mine. Silence settled between us. Not awkward, just heavy. The kind that pressed on your ears until you were forced to acknowledge it. So, Silas said eventually, is this where you read me my rights? I snorted quietly. You don't have any figures. I dried my hands and leaned back against the counter, keeping a careful distance. Close enough to help if he swayed, far enough not to set my instincts off again. You're angry, I said. He huffed a weak laugh. Brilliant observation, Hale. Promotion-worthy. I'm not asking for forgiveness. That's good, he replied. Because you wouldn't get it. I nodded. He deserved that much honesty. You want to know the worst part? He continued, eyes fixed on the opposite wall. For years, I told myself the system failed, that it was sloppy, inconsistent. I built my whole worldview around the idea that no one inside it cared enough to notice. His gaze slid back to me. Sharp. Assessing. Turns out someone noticed. Someone just chose not to finish the job. I didn't choose you, I said quietly. I chose the gap. Silas's mouth twisted. That's supposed to make it better. No, I admitted. It's just the truth. I pushed off the counter and sat in the chair opposite him, hands clasped loosely. I'm not a savior. I never was. I don't overthrow systems. I don't make speeches. I delay. I reroute. I buy time and hope the city forgets. And when it doesn't? Then people die, I said. Just not always the ones the system intended. He studied me for a long moment. You're saying that like it's a moral compromise instead of a coping mechanism. That's because it's both. A corner of his mouth lifted despite himself. Wow. You're terrible at inspirational speeches. I don't give those. Another beat of silence passed. The hum of the building's hidden generators filled the space, steady and impersonal. I don't want to be a symbol, Silas said suddenly. I looked up. What? Don't make me the face of your guilt, he said, or your redemption. I'm not here to prove the system's broken. It already is. I wasn't planning to. Good. He shifted, wincing, then waved it off. Because if one more person tries to turn me into a lesson, I'm biting them. I almost smiled. You don't get to be clean, he added, voice quieter now. Not after this. Not after me. I know. And I don't get to pretend you're just another villain in a suit, he said reluctantly. Which is annoying. That's fair. Our eyes met again. Something unspoken passing between us. Not trust, not forgiveness, recognition. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware of the fragile standoff forming in a forgotten room. What happens now? Silas asked. I exhaled slowly. Now we lie, carefully. I make you disappear without erasing you. You heal. You decide what you want to be when no one's watching. And you? Stay, I said. I clean just enough mess to keep worse people from stepping in. He considered that, then nodded once. Temporary truce, then. Temporary, I agreed. Silas leaned back against the wall, eyes closing briefly. Don't mistake this for absolution. I won't. And don't touch me again unless you warn me first, he added dryly. Your internal filing system is terrifying. That earned a genuine chuckle from me, low and tired. Noted. The silence that followed was lighter somehow. Not safe, but survivable. A fragile peace, balanced on honesty instead of illusion. For now, it was enough. The server room was colder than the rest of the building by design. Rows of black cabinets stretched into the dark, tiny indicator lights, blinking in steady rhythms like a mechanical heartbeat. The air hummed with restrained power, the kind that didn't threaten until it did. I stood alone in front of the primary console, my access badge heavy in my pocket. This was the part no one ever wrote reports about. I keyed in the override slowly, deliberately, as if rushing might make the system notice intent instead of action. Old code unfolded across the screen, layers upon layers of legacy architecture no one bothered to update because it worked. Because it had always worked. Because it had always known where everyone belonged. You don't need to break, I murmured under my breath. Just look away. The final gap wasn't dramatic. No red warnings. No alarms. Just a small reroute. Classification thresholds loosened by fractions. Sent verification loops allowed to resolve later instead of immediately. Identity checks delayed. Not erased. Delayed. Enough to breathe. Enough to move. I hit execute. For a moment, nothing happened. The lights didn't flicker. The servers didn't scream. The system didn't collapse into chaos like every disaster scenario ever predicted. It just blinked. A pause. A half-second of indecision rippled through the network, invisible to anyone not watching closely. Then the flow resumed. I leaned my hands on the console, heart pounding, sweat cooling at the base of my neck. Data streams adjusted themselves, compensating the way any adaptive system did when something no longer fit quite right. Registration didn't stop. It softened. Back in my office, the effects began to surface almost immediately. Minor discrepancies flagged and resolved without escalation. Omegas who should have triggered correction queues instead rolled into extended review. Alphas whose scent profiles fluctuated beyond acceptable variance were marked pending instead of non-compliant. People didn't vanish en masse. They slipped. Just enough. June poked her head into my office an hour later, eyes bright with confusion. Sir? The intake metrics are weird. Weird how? They're still within parameters, she said slowly. But they're not snapping into place like they used to. I nodded. The city updated its filters last night. Expect some adjustment. She frowned. Is that good? It's survivable, I said. That seemed to satisfy her, or at least confuse her enough not to push. She left, muttering about rerunning her reports. I closed the door and turned back to my desk. Silas Vane's file waited there, open and unresolved. I didn't rush this part. I stripped the file down piece by piece, severing dependencies, rerouting references, collapsing identifiers into placeholders that meant nothing to anyone but the system itself. His registry number dissolved into a string of nulls. His scent profile fragmented, scattering across subcategories that no longer converged. Alive, but unlocatable. When I finished, the screen displayed a single line. Status, unknown. No red, no contradiction. Just absence. I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion settling deep into my bones. Outside the window, the city glowed as it always had, brilliant, indifferent, impossible to fully map. The system hadn't fallen. It had simply lost its grip. Over the next few days, the ripple spread quietly. Field teams reported fewer clean resolutions, more delays, more cases that required human judgment instead of automated closure. Rowan complained about inefficiency in meetings, frowning at charts that refused to behave. Probably a calibration issue, he said dismissively. IT will sort it out. I smiled and took notes. Silas didn't appear in any reports. No sightings. No flagged anomalies. No whispers in internal memos. He'd vanished so completely that even the myths went quiet, as if the street itself had decided to protect him. Late one night, alone in my office again, I opened the system logs one last time and searched his name. Nothing came back. I closed the window and sat there for a long moment, listening to the hum of the building, the soft ticking of a clock I'd never bothered to replace. This wasn't a victory. Victories were loud, celebrated, claimed. This was something smaller and more dangerous. A precedent. The system had learned that it could hesitate. And once a machine learns hesitation, it can be taught restraint. I shut down my console and stood, straightening my jacket out of habit. Tomorrow, I would be reliable again. Calm, unremarkable, the good beta who kept things running smoothly. But somewhere beyond the reach of my screens, an omega with an unclassifiable scent was breathing freely. For now, that would have to be enough. Still loosening the edges, I said. Carefully. He nodded, satisfied. Good. I'd hate to think you did all that just for me. I didn't. Yeah, he said, smiling faintly. I know. He gestured toward the workbench behind him, where a half-disassembled scent stabilizer lay next to a notebook filled with cramped handwriting. I'm calling myself Elias now. I raised an eyebrow. Creative. Hey, I wanted something boring, he said. Something that doesn't come with expectations. That might be the most rebellious thing you've ever done. He laughed, real and unguarded, and the sound settled into the space between us like it belonged there. I don't hate you anymore, he said after a while. I didn't flinch. That's generous. Don't get used to it. He took a sip of his coffee, grimaced. You make terrible recommendations. I didn't recommend anything. Exactly. We watched a pair of teenagers pass by the window, one laughing too loudly, the other pretending not to care. Somewhere down the street, a delivery truck backfired. Normal sounds. Normal life. I'm not a symbol, Silas said quietly, and I'm not your absolution. I know, I replied. But, he added, you're not the villain I thought you were. That's a low bar. He shrugged. The city's full of worse men with cleaner hands. A comfortable pause followed. No weight. No tension demanding resolution. I checked my watch and stood. I have a meeting. Of course you do, he said. Go be responsible. I hesitated, then extended my hand across the table. He looked at it, amused. You warned me last time. I'm warning you now. He took it briefly, the contact careful and contained. No static this time. No internal alarms, just warmth, fleeting and human. Take care, Matt Hale, he said. You too, Elias, I replied. I left the cafe and walked back into the city, my badge heavy in my pocket, my steps steady. The system would keep running. It always did. But now, it paused. Now it blinked. And somewhere in the space that hesitation created, people lived who didn't fit neatly anywhere. Systems love categories. Living things never do.